Father, help us to be faithful in our reading, but even more, help us to be faithful in our doing. Father, I thank you for all of these people who have joined together each Saturday. And Father, continue to bless us as we seek to understand more clearly what you've presented to us. It's in the name of Jesus we pray. Amen. Okay, one of the things that I've really stressed is getting a sense of the Gospel of Mark in terms of the way it's laid out. And so I want to take us just briefly over to the outlines again and remind us that after we got past the introduction where Mark clearly lays out his at least his initial assessment for his readers of who Jesus is, he starts us on a series of narratives that are hooked together, I think, in some pretty tight ways. For example, in the first chapter, Jesus calls the four fishermen. Later on in chapter 2, he calls Levi. And then in chapter 3, we get a list of the disciples that Jesus has called, kind of the first formation of his closest community. And what's interesting is that in between those calling stories, in between the first set of calling stories, we have Jesus doing a series of miracles. So we have a demon-possessed man, Peter's mother-in-law, and then later on in the chapter, the leper. Jesus heals a leper, and Jesus heals a paralytic. But what I've stressed to you is that these Markan sandwiches, as they're laid out in layers, the Markan sandwiches often end up in the middle with something that kind of helps you shape how you're reading the other stories. And so in some ways, I think one of the blessings you get from the approach that I'm trying to lead you into is the notion that Mark has laid out his story quite carefully, and he wants us to read the stories with each other and also off of each other. And so we end up with a series of miracle stories in the first section of Mark, from Mark 1:21 down to chapter 2, verse 12. Then we get the calling of Levi, and that introduces a series of controversy stories. Also, I want you to, we're getting some language for what to call these stories. And so we're going to see these miracle stories, and we're going to see these controversy stories coming up over and over again in Mark. We're also going to have some calling stories where Jesus calls disciples to come after him. And so, but again, in chapter 2, following the call of Levi, Jesus eats with Levi and sinners, and he's called out on it by religious leaders. Jesus is again asked why he doesn't fast. And then after that, in chapter 2, verse 23, his disciples will pick grain on the Sabbath, and Jesus will heal a withered hand on the Sabbath, making the declaration that the Sabbath was actually made for humans and not the other way around. But in the middle between these controversy stories, there will be a clarification story. I think that might be a good way to identify it, in which Jesus explains why the new and the old don't mix together. And basically the answer there is that it doesn't mix, not because one's giving up, say, the Old Testament and the other's not. That's not what's going on here. It's just that Jesus has got a different way of approaching the law, and it's in contrast with and in conflict with the religious leaders of the day. Along the way, Mark will give us these little summaries of Jesus's ministry. You'll notice that in the first, I'm going to scroll back down again. You'll have a summary after a couple of miracles in the first part. And then as we go down to after Jesus's disciples pick grain on the Sabbath and heals a withered hand, there's another summary. So expect these summaries along the way. So that's kind of a rehearsal of how we get there. So basically we end up with Jesus beginning to call his disciples, and at the end we end up with a formation of a group that's around Jesus. I want to, let me switch to another outline. In this particular outline, we pick up right after the declaration of the 12. And then there's a conversation about, or there's a story about Jesus' family coming to get him. And then there's a bit of controversy with the religious leaders over who Jesus really is. And then we end up with a story that leads into who is Jesus' true family, which is interesting because these stories come right after the calling of the disciples. So he's got his 12 around him, and he's got a larger group of people that are following along with him. And Jesus declares that his family is actually those who do the will of God. He doesn't explain that. He just puts it out there. And then he gives a series of parables, which we looked at last week. And these parables are really around the ideal of how careful are you willing to listen to Jesus. And so I've really stressed heavily that the parables have something with seeing and perceiving and hearing and understanding. And again, Jesus in between, again, a great example of a Markan sandwich is Jesus tells a parable, then he interprets the parable, but in between the parable, he gives a little bit of a warning, which says from Isaiah, folks will always be seeing but never quite getting it, and hearing and not quite understanding it. Otherwise, they might turn. And I invited you to pay attention to that text from Isaiah chapter 6, because it will show up again. In fact, it'll show up again later today. And so there's a series of parables, the parable of the growing seed, the mustard seed. Those parables are about things that start small and are almost impossible to perceive, and they become much larger and very evident. And so Jesus, I think, is talking about basically the declaration of who he is. Another way to say that is the kingdom of God, right? Is that it's the growth of the kingdom of God. And the thing that comes right after the parable section is the story of the calming of the storms, and raises what I think is kind of the critical question of the book. Who is this? And by the way, since I believe Mark is written to believers, I think it's to shake sleepy believers, afraid believers, scared believers up a little bit, to remind them who Jesus is. So I don't think this is a declaration. I don't think Mark was necessarily intended as an evangelistic tract, although certainly it can serve that purpose. But it's designed to help believers who have a tendency of wanting Jesus to be their kind of Jesus. I think it's designed to wake us up a little bit. So I'm going to switch now to the outline that we're going to be working with today. Let me reduce the size of this so you can kind of see the whole of it. This is one of the harder sections to outline because it doesn't have the nice tight structure that the earlier sections had. And I've suggested to you that one of the reasons that this is the case is that Mark is taking us on a journey of following Jesus. He's invited us. And when I read the book, it's really easy for me to kind of identify with those 12 who are attempting to figure out who Jesus is. And let me just walk you through the outline. I'm not going to necessarily be able to touch on all of these stories. So let me just remind you that one of the conditions for rereading is simply reading the text. So I'm assuming that you've read the text, and I know obviously as believers, you've read it several times. So in the, what I've done is I've put stories together that I think ought to go together, and I may have missed something. And so let me just walk you a little bit through my logic on this. The calming of the storm and the calming of the demoniac are parallel stories in which the question is asked in one, who is this? And it's answered in the second one by the demoniac in very bold terms. Okay, the next story that follows is the healing of Jairus' daughter, and the sandwich formation of the stories that are interlocked here are pretty clear. There's the healing of Jairus' daughter. As Jesus is on the way, he's interrupted by a woman who sneaks up on him. And then the story is continued, and Jairus' daughter is healed. So I call it basically 1 and 2, divided by the story in between. And then follows, Jesus is rejected again in his hometown. A prophet's not welcomed in his hometown, which looks back to earlier text about Jesus being previously rejected, the family of Jesus. The next thing that happens is Jesus sends out the 12, but I want you to notice that Jesus' sending out of the 12 is is broken up by their return, their return in chapter 6. But in between the sending of the 12, in between the sending of the 12 and the return of the 12, Mark tells us the story of Herod's beheading of John the Baptist. And by the way, it's a very full account compared to the other Gospels. And so Mark spends a great deal of energy. In fact, it's almost 20 some odd verses on Herod. And I want to reflect a little bit on why that might be. Then there's the feeding of the 5,000. And Jesus walks on the water, which, by the way, remember I told you last week to look for double stories. We've got the calming of the storm on water, and now we've got Jesus walking on water. And so we've got two miracle stories together, and then a summary section about Jesus healing many. In chapter 7, Jesus does some teaching on the nature of clean and unclean, which, by the way, is a continuation of the conflict stories earlier. It's another conflict story in which Jesus challenges basically the Pharisaic understanding of what makes a person clean. It's not surprising to me then that what follows right after that is the healing of a Syro-Phoenician woman, basically a foreign woman who's considered unclean by first century Israelite culture. And so Jesus has a discussion about what makes a person clean or unclean. And then the next story is an encounter with a person typically considered unclean. And then we have one of my favorite Markan sandwiches. You have the healing of the deaf mute near Decapolis, the feeding of 4,000 near Decapolis, followed by teaching on yeast and the yeast of the Pharisees and Herod. Do you still not understand? And then there's that two-stage healing that David mentioned already. And it's only after this part of the journey that Jesus takes his disciples way north, and he asks them, who do people say that I am? And in Mark's gospel, Peter's confession is very brief. You are the Christos, you are the Messiah. And so that's the kind of journey that we take between chapters 4 and chapters 8. And it's a bit of a meander, but if you break the stories down in terms of the stories that ought to be read together, you begin to see interplay between those stories. I can't do every story today, but I want to give you some samplings of it so that you get a feel for how I think we can read these stories at a deeper level. And so I'm going to switch my screen one more time to my Bible program. And I pray that I've not gone too fast for you. So the first thing I want to look at is the closing out of the parables with the story of the calming of the storm. Let me get that a little larger in case some of you are using your phones. When evening came, this is after the parable stories, let us go to the other side. You guys know the story. There's a furious squall that comes up. They wake up Jesus. They call him teacher, which is an identity marker. Teacher, don't you care if we drown? Question of Jonah, by the way. He got up and rebuked the wind and said, be still. And it was perfectly calm. And Jesus says to his disciples, and this is the beginning of some very sharp things that he asked his disciples. They're rhetorical questions in a way, but they're also kind of sharp. Why are you so afraid? By the way, we've traveled with Jesus for the last several chapters, and he's been able to handle everything in front of him. So, but why are you still afraid? Why do you still have no faith? And by the way, what's interesting in the Gospel of Mark is that the counterpart to faith, that is the opposite of faith, is not unfaith or unbelief, it's actually fear. And so often in the Gospel of Mark, if you're afraid, you're confessing really you're not faithful. Afraid and faithful, those are kind of the two poles that are played out. Another thing to watch in the Gospel of Mark, guys, is the response from various peoples to Jesus. And it's anywhere from amazement to fear to belief. And so they ask the question at the end of what we've marked out as chapter 4, who is this? And then it's premised around the notion of even the wind and the waves obey him. So Mark sets up for us to ponder. By the way, Mark's already given us his answer, remember? Chapter 1 through 15. So it's not as if we don't know, but we get to sit back and watch how the disciples discern over a period of time who Jesus is. And that's how Mark wants to take us on a journey. And so now that the storm's out of the way, they get to the other side. There is a demoniac there that nobody's able to control. In fact, it says no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain. No one was strong enough to subdue him. And remember, John the Baptist, the one who comes after me, will be mightier or stronger than I am. And so this is picking up on Jesus, on the theme of Jesus being the stronger one. Night and day among the tombs, he used to cry out and cut himself. When he saw Jesus, he shouted out at the top of his voice, verse 7. Now notice, in the last story, the question was, who is this? And here's this guy, this random guy, this demoniac, who screams out, what do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? That's pretty clear on the identification there. In God's name, don't torture me. But Jesus had said to him, come out of this man, you impure spirit. Jesus asked him, what is your name? My name is Legion, for we are many. That's scary enough, isn't it? And he begged Jesus again and again not to send him out of the area. A large herd of pigs was feeding on the nearby hill, or the nearby hillside. The demons begged Jesus, send us among the pigs, allow us to go into them. He gave them permission, and the impure spirits came out and went into the pigs. The herd, about 2,000 in number, rushed down the steep bank into the lake and was drowned. Those tending the pigs ran off and reported this in the town and countryside, and the people went to see what had happened. When they came to Jesus, they saw the man who had been possessed by the legion of demons sitting there dressed in his right mind, and they were afraid. I think it's kind of an important follow-up. And they were afraid that the demon-possessed man was no longer possessed. Those who had seen it told the people what had happened to the demon-possessed man and told about the pigs as well. Then the people began to plead with Jesus to leave their region. As Jesus was getting into the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed begged to go with him. Jesus did not let him, but said, go home to your own people and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he's had mercy on you. And so the man went away and began to tell in the Decapolis, notice the location, the Decapolis, how much Jesus had done for him, and all the people were amazed. You guys probably have some questions about this text. I usually do too, but I want to just point out a couple of things. There's a little bit of play with Roman politics in here, and I don't know what to make of it. A legion was typically 6,000 men, but when it was peacetime, a legion usually reduced down to about 2,000. Interesting, there's 2,000 pigs. Is it a commentary on Roman politics? I don't know. At the end of the day, I always thought it was a big waste of bacon. I'm sure some of you thought the same thing too, right? Couple of points that's worth pointing out is that the local people are actually scared the man's in his right mind now. That scares them more than him being in his demon-possessed state. The other thing that I think is interesting, and probably the bigger thing in the Gospel of Mark, is that this is the only person in the Gospel of Mark who's actually allowed to go and tell who Jesus is. All the way we've been prepared, Jesus telling demon-possessed people, or the demons, not to say who he is because they knew who he is. But we get to this story, and he's allowed to tell. I think the reason he's allowed to tell is because it's embedded in what Jesus says here. Go home to your own people and tell them how much the Lord has done for you. And I'm almost willing to bet that if Jesus was gesturing, he pointed up, not to himself. He pointed to the Father. So, tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you. Obviously, there's no comments about showing the religious people or the priest, because actually we're on the other side of the lake. The Decapolis is a Gentile area. And so there's a good chance that this person is even Gentile. That identity is never quite fully made for us. But I want you to notice, tell them how much the Lord has done for you. So the man went away and began to tell in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him. Notice the identification here. He's told to go tell how much the Lord has done for him, but he ends up telling how much Jesus has done for him. And so I think along with the confession from the demons, the reason this person is allowed to tell is because he actually knows who Jesus is. He's good press, not bad press, so to speak.
Stan, there's a couple of comments.
Oh, no doubt.
Danica's just asking, like, is it really a waste of bacon if if they didn't eat pork anyway? And then Bill was commenting, was it Bill? Yeah, Bill, but the pigs might indicate not Jewish.
Yeah, I think that's right. I don't think you're not raising pigs if you don't eat them. Okay. Right?
And Maria's saying that Jesus was starting to reach to the Gentiles. He was to prove the power of miracles done by Jesus.
Yeah, the Decapolis region, by the way, the name Decapolis is basically the 10 cities, and it's a region across the Jordan River and across from the Sea of Galilee that was occupied by various Gentiles, not Jewish people. Yeah. I really think that what the pigs do, I mean, we can talk about where they fit in the life of the kosher life of Jews, but really the kind of the narrative impact of this is that what these demons actually wanted to do to the man is what they did to the pigs. I want you to think about that. What they actually wanted to do to the man, they did to the pigs. And so ultimately demons were about destroying the man. And again, I'm left with all kinds of questions there. But I do think that we end up with an individual at the end who is invited to tell, apart from everybody else who's being told throughout the Gospel of Mark not to tell. And so in some ways, I think this ought to be read with the calming of the storm, because this is the calming of the man, calming of the storm. Basically, that both stories deals with Jesus's ability to handle chaos. Let me do just really quickly one more story, and then I want to jump all the way down to the double stories, just because we can't do everything in our time frame. What I want you to notice about the next story is that the women that are in the story are actually, I'm going to use the word related, but I don't mean in the kinship sense. When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, so we're back over on the Jewish side, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue leaders, kind of a significant leader in the community named Jairus, came and saw Jesus and fell at his feet. That tells you he thinks something of Jesus, right? He pleads earnestly with him, "My daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she may be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed upon him. A woman was there who'd been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had. And yet, instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, if I just touched his clothes, I will be healed. Immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was free from suffering. At once Jesus realized the power had gone out from him. He turned around to the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" "You see, the people are crying against you," his disciples said, "and yet you ask who touched me?" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear, told the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from suffering." While Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. "Your daughter is dead." They said, "Why bother the teacher anymore?" Overhearing what they said, Jesus told him, "Don't be afraid." Remember I talked about the polar opposites? Don't be afraid, just believe. He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. And when they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, "Why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead but asleep." But they laughed at him. After he put them out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which I mean, little girl, I say to you, get up. Immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. Notice that age marker. And at this, they were completely astonished. And he gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this and told them to give her something to eat. Again, more secrecy, right? What I want you to notice here, and although there's lots of things to touch on, is the way these two stories connect with each other. The woman had suffered for 12 years. The little girl was 12 years old. So for as long as the little girl was alive, this woman had suffered. Another thing to notice is that one of these girls are on the top of the economic status, and the other is at the very bottom. And so you've got a bit of a contrast between the two women that are in the story. The other thing that I find interesting is that Jesus and the story itself uses the word daughter to describe them. Both the Jairus' daughter is called daughter, and the woman who is healed is called daughter. And so it is another indication that these stories, while chronologically this may be exactly how they happen, they're actually hooked together at some thematic levels. And there's probably some other things that you can note about the stories. Let me also just touch on verse 41. 41 has a duplicate story in the book of Acts with the raising of Dorcas. Dorcas's Jewish name was, in fact, Tabitha. Talitha is the word for little girl in Aramaic. Kum is get up. And so actually the literal translation of Talitha Kum is little girl get up. Talitha. Tabitha's name would have been pronounced Tabitha with a B instead of an L. And so we can imagine in Acts chapter 10 that when Peter is involved in the raising of Dorcas, who is also called Tabitha, that he actually said Tabitha cum. Talitha cum in Mark, Tabitha cum in Acts.
Stan, Wendy has a question. She can't type it in the text box, but she is asking how the woman with the bleeding would have been in a crowd. She would have been considered unclean and should have been outside the city.
Well, I think that's why she's afraid of them. I think she's really afraid that if she's found out after the healing, that maybe she'll even lose what she got because she knew that she was violating. Notice that Mark doesn't really tell that to us as readers. He's assuming we probably know that. So, but I think that's a note that commentators often make, is that because of the perpetual bleeding, she's perpetually unclean in Jewish ritual circles. Again, what I'm wanting you to do is kind of read the stories as they're interlaced together and ask yourself, why are these two stories being told at the same time? Okay, I want to do one more set of stories. And so we're going to jump all the way over to chapter 7. Oh, there's so much good stuff between, but...
Stan, before you jump away, can I ask a question?
Sure.
So you were talking about the connection between faith and fear.
Yeah.
And so as you were speaking about the woman who was healed after 12 years, she was afraid.
Yeah.
But she had the faith to be healed.
Yeah.
You want to speak on that for a moment?
Well, I want to say that there's an inner dynamic. I probably did leave it a little bit too polarized in the sense that it's one or the other. But a little bit later, we're going to read in the Gospel of Mark, and a father's going to say, I believe, help my unbelief. And so there's this kind of inner dynamic of how those two things fit together. I think the woman in this story is a picture of courage because she is afraid, but she's still acting in faith. So, yeah. So
well, she
I don't
takes
think
risks, doesn't she?
Yeah, she takes risks. She's willing to reach out. She knows that by the way, what's interesting, another link in the story is the synagogue leader, Jairus, knows that his only hope is Jesus. If his daughter's to have a chance, the woman who sneaks up behind Jesus also understands that her only hope is Jesus. And so there's another interlock between those two stories. Because you've got a religious leader who is most likely not to want to believe in Jesus coming to the place of belief in Jesus. I'd love to know some of these stories after the story we get. What happened to these people next? Would love to know that. Yeah. Yeah, David, thank you for slowing us down to nuance that a bit. Yeah. Yeah. I think courage, faith can be mixed with the dynamic of fear. But I also think in the Gospel of Mark, you find totally afraid. They asked Jesus to leave their town. Sounds like a few churches I've been in. I won't name them. But you're in a bad place if you're inviting Jesus to leave. So, oh, there's so much good stuff here. I want to, hang on, I'm looking for a story. Okay, by the way, let me just stop and hover again in chapter 7 to remind you, Isaiah keeps popping up over and over again. And so Mark's got a strong connection to Isaiah. I'd love to cover this story, but I want to take us to, I'll get us there. Then Jesus left the vicinity of Tyre and went through Sidon. By the way, these are less than the best Jewish places in the story of Israel. They left the vicinity of Tyre and went through Sidon down to the Sea of Galilee into the region of the Decapolis. We know who's from the Decapolis. Remember, that was that demon-possessed guy. There some people brought to him a man who was deaf and could hardly talk. They begged Jesus to place his hand on him. After Jesus took him aside, away from the crowd, Jesus put his fingers in the man's ears, and then he spit and touched the man's tongue. He looked up to heaven, and with a deep sigh, he said, again Aramaic, "Ephatha," which means be opened. And at this, the man's ears were opened, and his tongue was loosened, and he began to speak plainly. Okay, anybody willing to say this is kind of a weird miracle story? Yeah, and that whole spit thing, what did he do with the spit exactly? What's going on in this spit thing? I want to now take you to the bottom of chapter 8, to that double story that sounds a whole lot like this story, and then we'll just compare a little bit. So we go down to chapter 8. There it is, 8:22. They came to Bethesda. By the way, the other story is in the Decapolis. This story is back in Jewish territory. They came to Bethesda, and some people brought a blind man and begged Jesus to touch him. It already sounds like that other story. He took the blind man by the hand and led him outside the village. Sounds just like that other story. When he had spit on the man's eyes, he put his hands on him. Jesus asked, "Do you see anything?" He looked up and said, "I see people. They look like trees walking around." Once more, Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes. Then his eyes were opened, his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Jesus sent him home, saying, don't even go into the village. Notice that the very next story is Jesus in Caesarea Philippi asking, "Who do people say that I am?" These stories are amazingly alike. And so, to me, they're an indicator we're probably supposed to read these two stories together. And what we notice is that there's stuff in between them. And so let's see if we can't get a handle. The first guy is a mute guy, a guy who's deaf. And because he cannot hear, he cannot speak clearly. So get that connection. He is deaf and he cannot speak. Jesus, in both of these stories, makes it a private event. He pulls the people away. Also common is other people are bringing these individuals to Jesus. And the common denominators, these stories, I often say, these stories are held together by spit. Jesus acts out the healing, draws attention to it. It's different. What's problematic for us is that Jesus has done all things well until we get to this last miracle that we're talking about. So the first guy is deaf and cannot speak plainly. The second guy is blind and cannot see clearly at first. Okay, you kind of got this in your head. So the two stories are together. Let's spend a little time with the stuff between the stories and see if we get some clarity with it. So let me back up.
Stan, while you're backing up, I'm just going to share what Wendy said, who is visually impaired. She said, as much as I would like to see clearly, I'm not sure that I would want anyone putting spit on my eyes. That would really take a lot of faith. Yet again, I would love to see you, so I would probably do it.
Yeah, but it's Jesus spit. It's special spit. Okay, in chapter 8, the very next story after that first miracle story, there is the feeding of the 4,000. During those days, another large crowd gathered. Since they had nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples and said, I have compassion for these people. They have already been with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them home hungry, they will collapse on the way because some of them have come a long distance. His disciples answered, but where in this remote place can we get enough bread to feed them? How many loaves do you have? Jesus asked. 7, they replied. He told the crowd to sit down, and when he had taken the 7 loaves, given thanks, and broke them and gave them to his disciples to distribute to the people, and they did so. They had a few small fish as well. He gave thanks for them also and told the disciples to distribute them. The people ate and were satisfied. Afterwards, the disciples picked up 7 baskets full of broken pieces that were left over. About 4,000 were present, and he sent them away. He got into a boat with his disciples and went to the region of Dalmanutha. At this point, the Pharisees came to Jesus and began to question Jesus. To test him, they asked him for a sign from heaven. He sighed deeply and said, why does this generation ask for a sign? Truly, I will tell you, no sign will be given it. He then left and got back into the boat and crossed to the other side. I want you to notice here that the Pharisees, who probably witnessed or at least heard about the feeding of the 4,000, they're asking for something to see. And what was one of our guys' problem? Oh, he couldn't see. And so the Pharisees, the religious leaders in our narrative, are asking for a sign to see. Okay, let's get a little more personal in chapter 8, verse 14. The disciples had forgotten to bring bread except 1 loaf they had with them in the boat. I want you to catch that, because your fast reading of that story is that they didn't have any bread. That's not what the story says. The story says they didn't have any bread with them, but they did have some bread back in the boat. And Jesus uses the bread as a symbol for teaching. Be careful, Jesus warned them. Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and of Herod. They discussed this with one another and said, it's because we have no bread. By the way, if you ever need an excuse, that's it. We forgot to bring bread. And so they discussed with one another. Aware of their discussion, Jesus asked them, why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see and ears but fail to hear? Notice how these hook with our miracle stories? We got one guy who can't hear, can't speak plainly, and another guy who can't see and can't describe what he's seeing plainly. So do you have eyes but fail to see and ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember when I broke the 5 loaves for 5,000, how many basketful of pieces did you pick up? 12. And when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many basketful of pieces did you pick up? 7. He said to them, do you still not understand? So we have a guy who can't hear. Oh, we have a guy who can't hear. And then we have a guy who can't see. In between, we have Pharisees who can't see. But more importantly, we actually have disciples who can't see or hear. Now let's take a look at that second miracle story. This one always caused people a bit of trouble. Jesus asked, do you see anything? And he looked up and said, I see people, they look like trees walking around. This person was not born blind. He is able to remember what trees look like. Once more, Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes, and the eyes were opened. His sight was restored. Restored is an interesting word there, because it continues to say he was able to see again. And he saw everything clearly. Notice in the previous story that when the man, the mute man, the deaf man was healed, he was able to explain everything clearly. This man is able now to see everything clearly. And so I think the miracle stories in the gospel, particularly these two miracle stories, they function sort of as parables too. And I would suggest that the punchline, although it's not spelled out here, is that when you don't see clearly, you might need Jesus to touch you again. And one of the things that I told you to watch for in chapters 5 through 8 is the number of times double stories are told. You've got double sayings about bread. You've got Jesus doing things that you got two water miracles. You got Jesus walking on the water and calming the storm. And there's several more in which you have kind of duplicate stories. Jairus's daughter and the woman with the hemorrhage are sort of parallel stories. And so I'd like to suggest that rhetorically what's happening here is Mark is giving us as believers a second chance to see Jesus again. David, does that satisfy you at any level? Okay, we'll wrestle with the story forever then.
And I'm just, both Jana and Wendy had a very similar comment, although Wendy's is a little more, she never thought of that, like the being able to see the tree, because if he was totally blind, he would never know what trees look like.
Mm-hmm.
And that would be like me being able to see a game because I used to see quite a bit, even though I've always been blind. And Jana said, yeah, the trees, that was sort of a wow moment for her. Yeah.
Notice that when we get into the next section, that Peter says, "You are the Messiah," and then Jesus says, "Good." What that means is I'm going up to Jerusalem and I'm going to die. Notice what it says about Jesus in verse 32. He spoke plainly about this. You mean a bit like the deaf guy who could now hear? He could speak plainly. And so Mark is doing some parallel work between, basically it's seeing and perceiving, seeing and hearing. And so he's playing with these themes of seeing and hearing all the way throughout. And so I think these miracle stories are placed right before the confession of who Jesus is, because we've actually got disciples in the middle between those two stories who can't see or hear yet. And we find out very quickly that even though Peter says you are the Messiah, he still doesn't see or hear clearly yet. He gets a right word out, but that's about it. So anyway, I'd love to touch on some of the other stories, but I think these gives you some reading tips on how to read these stories kind of coherently and together. And so that Mark is willing to leave intention that Jesus needs to do a double healing is not about Jesus's power. It's about what we need to experience. That is the second touch.
Stan, there's a couple of comments I'd like to just have you comment on. Anastasia, if people can be around Jesus all the time and still not see or hear, what does that say about our tendency to not see or hear him?
Yep.
And then Annie McKinnon, amazing how willing Jesus is to touch us again. The lack of our understanding is not on his part.
Yeah. One of the points that I'll make as we get closer to the end is that it seems that Mark's audience are Christians who know who Jesus is, but they're afraid to tell because they're scared. And so Mark is taking us through a journey of Jesus's life to show us ways in which Jesus was exceptionally compassionate, even though at times he's quite brutal in his assessment, but quite compassionate in giving people time to see again. And so Mark, I think, is a great story to help believers in our time to see Jesus again. So again, I haven't touched on all of the stories, but I wanted to give you enough so that you can see that there's this interesting thread running all the way through the Gospel of Mark, persistently asking you, do you know who Jesus is? And I think the sub question that's always there, are you willing to follow this Jesus? And as Wendy mentioned, even the one that's willing to spit in your eyes.
And are we willing to give others a chance to see Jesus again through our own lives?
I think it's true. Yeah. Again, let me go back to our outline. I know there's a lot that we didn't get to touch on just because of the time I'm trying to work within. Let me spend just a little bit of time here on Jesus sending out the 12 and the story of Herod between. What would be the purpose of telling the story of Herod beheading John between the sending out and the return of the disciples? John's story illustrates the ultimate cost of being a disciple of God. The cost of being a disciple is that it might take your life. That to speak truth to power, you might die. But I also think there's another interesting point that's made at the end of the narrative of John's story. John is beheaded, and Mark tells us that John's disciples came back for the body. What's going to happen at the end of our story? Any disciples coming back for the body of Jesus? And so there's more in the Herod beheading the John story that I'd like to get into. But when Jesus deals with divorce in chapter 10, and he mentions that a woman can divorce a husband, which is not a real Jewish thing in the first century, it is precisely reflecting back, I think, on the case of Herod, who Herod Antipas will divorce his wife, and Herodias will divorce her husband in order to be married to each other. So hold that in mind when you get there. But ultimately, I think the telling of the John the Baptist story is a story about the ultimate cost of discipleship. That to be true to your calling to God, that it may in fact cost you your life.
Stan, can I just take you back for one quick second?
Sure.
Karen Brown asked, can I just ask about 12 baskets and 7? What was the similar story?
Well, one of the connection I notice is that he started out with 7 and he ends up with 7. He starts out with 12, he ends up with 12, right? Let me get back to that a bit. Let me find my way back to that text. Okay, I'm at it. Hang on, let me put the screen over there so you can see it. So you're asking about the 12 and the 7. If you're looking for symbolic connections, I don't have any. Although the number 12 is interesting because the feeding of the 5,000 is among Jewish people, and the number 12 plays all kinds of things in the Jewish story, right? Namely the tribes. I wonder if the number 7 is kind of the number of completion as it gets played out all the way through in biblical narrative, in that it includes the Gentiles. The feeding of the 5,000 is a Jewish group, and the feeding of the 4,000 is in the Decapolis. Oh, by the way, I should probably note, do you know why there was 4,000 people in the Decapolis that came to hear Jesus? I think it's because he allowed that demoniac to go back and tell. Mark doesn't make that connection, but it seems to be a logical connection. So when I read it, how many basketfuls? 12. And then when I read how many, I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many? 7. And then the remark in chapter 8, verse 21, he said to them, do you still not understand? He's asking them not, do you understand the miracles? But he's saying, do you still not understand who I am yet? Which, of course, is where the story's leading to.
Mm-hmm. Anne is saying that, that there are 2 accounts, Mark 6 and Mark 8.
That's right. Yeah, because there's the feeding of the 5,000 and then there's feeding of the 4,000. Oh, David, that's a good comment too, is that we've got 12 years old daughter, 12 years of suffering, 12 apostles. Yeah, there's lots of places where the number 12 pops up. Yeah. Nobody has been able to explain it to me in a way that really satisfies me fully. And Mark doesn't come back and tell us that the symbols mean anything. That is, the numbers are symbolic. I get really nervous when folks do the symbolic game and they don't have really clear text to make it from. They're just drawing it because it seems convenient. Yeah.
I find it interesting. Jesus asks them and they give him a direct answer.
Yeah.
They weren't trying to figure out how many they
Oh,
knew
they
and
knew.
they responded immediately.
Yeah, that was yeah. Let me remind you that both of these stories echo desert stories from the Old Testament in which God provided for his children in the desert. In fact, in the first story, there's a really direct reference to Jesus having compassion for the people and wanting to make sure that they weren't sheep without shepherds, which of course is an echo back to Joshua being appointed as leader. There's a level at which Mark is telling a story that he hopes will entertain you too. And so he's conscious of the fact that the stories, once you get into these stories, you begin to ask other questions. And I think that's entirely the purpose of it. Did I miss anything else in the questions?
Wendy was just saying it seems that the people in the Decapolis are more willing to accept Jesus. Is that those who to accept? Wendy, do you want to read that?
Hey, Wendy.
Hey, Stan. So what I was saying was it's interesting that the people in the Decapolis who are Gentiles are willing to accept Jesus for who he is, starting with the demoniac, whereas the Jews themselves, who Jesus came for, are not willing to accept him for who he is.
That may potentially be true. Now, remember, the folks that were in the villages near the demoniac, they wanted Jesus to leave, and they were more afraid of a demoniac that was in his right mind than the one that was chained up in the tombs. But I would say that there's possibly less discipleship. I'm coming to learn is a lot of unlearning, and sometimes even in our best scenarios, I think there's a lot more to unlearn in the Jewish context, in the sense that it's not that they learned bad things, it's just the way they were framed is not the way Jesus is framing it. And so to become a Jewish disciple with Jesus is to enter a school of unlearning before you can learn things. And I think sometimes the folks on the outside, remember Jesus always said that that there were insiders and outsiders, and the irony here is that oftentimes the folks we were presumed to be outsiders are actually the real insiders. Here, the demoniac man, the folks. So there may be some of that going on, less to unlearn. The disciples themselves are in an unlearning process because they've got certain conceptions of what the Messiah is supposed to be. And so when Jesus begins to tell that he's going up to Jerusalem to die, that doesn't fit their scenario. And so they have to begin to unwind that story a bit. Anybody else? Well, let me give you just a little hint about how to read what comes next.
All right, I'll ask a question, Stan,
okay, David.
move on. So because we had been talking about faith versus fear at the beginning, I was with the double healing. My question was with regard to this: did the man's faith or fear have anything to do with that, or is that just a separate issue?
No, I don't see that as coming. I don't. Yeah, I think Jesus is intentionally blending miracle and parable in the way that he's chosen to do it. What's interesting is at the end of the first story, the deaf guy, it said he did the people are saying Jesus does everything well. So it's kind of humorous when you get to the second story and you're going, oh, he didn't do that one so well, did he? It's also interesting to watch how the other Gospels try to read this story. It appears to me that this story is problematic from the beginning because you have to balance, is Jesus really who he says he is? And of course, ultimately in the story, he is.
I was going to comment on the two-pace healing or two-step healing of the blind man.
Yeah.
And I think it speaks about the apostles being so not too smart to understand what's going on, even though Jesus has been doing so many things. And it applies to all of us too, that it takes forever sometimes for us to understand that, we can be healed, we would have faith and be healed, and we can grow slowly, but eventually we will get it. Or sometimes it takes a lot of provoking or, situational healing before we can be healed completely.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true, Maria. In some ways, I've suggested that Mark almost feels like it's intended to be a discipleship manual to a degree, to help us drill a little deeper in who Jesus is. And so I do think the two big questions of the Gospel of Mark remains, who is Jesus, and are you willing to follow him?
And the other thing about the two-step healing is that goes away from Mark's theme of things happening immediately.
It does. Actually, the whole story begins to slow down a bit at this point. And then when we get to chapter 11, we're dealing with just the last week of the ministry of Jesus. So as we read the next section, which is going to take us from chapter 8:27, basically the confession, the thing that's going to shape and mark out all the way down to the end of chapter 10, verse 52, is three passion predictions, three predictions in which Jesus tells, I'm going to Jerusalem and they're going to do me in. And what I want you to watch as you read that is the disciples work very hard not to talk about what Jesus wants to talk about. They always do a misdirection, and Jesus always brings them back. So watch what the disciples do every time Jesus says, I'm going to Jerusalem to die. Watch what's next, and how the disciples deal with trying not to hear Jesus. So,
Inga, do you want to go ahead and mention what you've put in the comment section?
Sure. I just noticed, I just am coming in randomly, so I haven't actually recently read through Mark's, but I've read it several times.
well,
but what I noticed,
confession's good for the soul, Inga.
but what I noticed is just all of the human effort and the human response. So how when there was a storm and Jesus was sleeping, the disciples' response was, Teacher, don't you care if we drown?
Yeah.
And that would be our natural response, even today as Jesus followers. Don't you care? You know? And then how the demon-possessed man, he was naturally chained up. And that's our natural response, is to contain someone like that. But Jesus came to really unchain him. Yeah. Set him free. And our natural response is to see a dead person and to wail and to cry, but Jesus raises a dead person to life. Yeah. And I think we have a tendency still to respond naturally, and Jesus is challenging us to believe for the supernatural.
Okay, yeah, I think it's certainly an invitation. Again, I think all of these miracles tie into helping us come to terms with who Jesus is. Yeah. So the disciples are pretty comfortable that he's a mighty military leader, perhaps, but they're quite uncomfortable with his ability to command nature or reproduce food. Yeah.
One of the things that I noticed on my initial reading of Mark, and you talked about how this came to kind of, it's recorded to kind of interrupt our life and our thought. I was amazed at how many times the word amazed is there. I started highlighting them, and how he wherever he went, people couldn't believe what they were seeing and hearing.
Yeah. And would you also say that but amazement is, of course, not necessarily the reaction Jesus is looking for. Amazement is not allegiance.
True.
Yeah. I think amazement is a logical response. Sure. Go ahead, Anne.
But you've got to be interrupted, and you've got to stop and look before you think that there's something worth responding to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, fair enough.
And I was surprised how many times throughout the entire book of Mark, pleading and begging is used. Demons begged and people pleaded, and like it's just this perpetual. And I wonder, like how many times have I begged God for something, or how many times have I pleaded with the Lord about whatever? And so that was very provocative for me.
Mm-hmm.
It's because I have no bread.
That's it. The answer for everything. Yeah. But notice, I want you to also notice carefully, although we're not able to view them, is Mark will sometimes throw out little tiny phrases to get you to think. For example, he'll say, they didn't have any bread except what was in the boat, the one loaf in the boat. And so you're going, okay, Mark's telling me they do have bread. But they are working in their mind, we don't have any bread. And by the way, after Jesus has fed 5,000 and 4,000, how many loaves of bread do you actually have to have? Maybe not even one. I don't, so. But the other way, so remember that when Jesus is with them in the storm, at the end of chapter 4, they took Jesus as he was. So Mark's throwing out these little tiny phrases occasionally to make you think, okay, what was that about? And it causes me to think when I come to that story is, am I willing to take Jesus as he was or as he is?